This is a long snapper. For much of their careers, they go unnoticed, unappreciated, and for 99% of football enjoyers, completely unknown. But what is this specialized position group? Why do we need them? And how did they come about? We want to know this because when we actually start to take a look about them, you realize, wait a second, they're kind of badass.
And then blown up by Spencer Thornton, the long snapper.
Green was down there, the long snapper.
Here catches it inside his 10. He bobbles it. Tulane's got it. Ethan Hudak comes up with it.
And it's their long snapper, Ross Madisick.
So the history of the long snapper is not like every other position. In fact, in the earliest days of football, it didn't even exist. We can see some footage from a 1903 game that on the punt, it was out of an offensive formation with the quarterback punting it at around 5 to 7 yards behind the line of scrimmage. So a normal snap sufficed. We can draw the same conclusion that for a field goal, which is probably around 7 yards behind the line of scrimmage, a normal snap would have been the go-to there as well. By the 1920s though, things already began to look different in the landscape of football. Bigger crowds and the meta of punt had shifted to where you can see the punter now at around 12 yards behind the line of scrimmage. This will require a different skill set than just snapping it from a 3-point stance. In fact, in 1919, we can see the Georgia Tech player long snap the ball to the punter and we get a sense of what the form is. You could essentially call it more like a throw-in for soccer. Just upside down, feet set, butt high in the air, crunched over to give you plenty of room to heave the ball. The follow through is short, his head stays down to make sure the punter catches it, then picks it up and the play resumes. This might feel like a pointless mumbo jumbo that I'm just harping on about, but it's really integral as we watch the development of this position. As we reach the end of the 20s, things for this position hadn't changed too much. However, it is interesting to note that they are able to snap the ball further. They did move the field goal holder back to what appears to be 9 yards, which by today's standards is freakishly long, and we see that correlate with how far the punt is, compared to the standard day 8-yard field goal and 14-yard punt formation. Now, by the 1930s, we can see in the Northwestern football match that things are already beginning to look pretty significantly different. The player snapping is significantly lower in his snap stance than a decade ago. His arms are extended out in front of him, and instead of a short over-the-head like throw, we see this long reach behind him to get the punter the ball. And maybe just as notably, he doesn't watch it all the way, but instead starts to block the person to his right. Now, does he block him well? I mean, hey, he didn't block the punt, so it's well enough, right? But we can also see that he's sporting the number 36, so he's likely a skilled position player because the numbers of 1 through 50 were meant to be people who played in the backfield. The opposing team gives us a better look at how it's gripped, with one hand on top of the ball and the other hand on the laces beneath it, which is a common way to throw a spiral from this hand position. So early in the game, we already see a lot of the modern groundwork for the long snapping position, although at the time it wasn't a specialist position, just something that somebody on the team did, which was also like punting and kicking. We would get another view into something important too, as you can see the punter is forced to take off and run on this play, probably because 12 yards and a slower snap meant that there was a high likelihood to get that punt blocked. So while the form was there, we still had a very long way to go until we get to the pure consistency, speed, and effectiveness of the modern snapper. 1937, we're going to go take a look at what things looked like on the biggest stage nearly a half a century since the game's creation. A snap right into the lap of punter and quarterback Sammy Baugh. Now, this turns into a fake punt situation, but we can tell that snappers are getting better. And as we look through the 40s and 50s, they would slowly but surely get better as punters would carefully back up a couple of yards and field goal units would carefully move forward a couple yards, requiring more velocity on punt, more accuracy on field goals. But the 60s and 70s, we began to see a slow and steady shift. You see, at this point, we had started to see players shift towards special teams being less of a necessary evil and more of something that could actually give you a very, very sizable advantage. The introduction of the soccer-style kick by Fred Bednarski in 1954 to the college realms eventually made its way to the NFL with Pete Gogolak. And also around this time, we would see true kickers start to take over special teams roles like Packers legend Dick Sashane, one of, if not the first player who was ever rostered in the NFL to purely perform special teams roles of kicking and punting. And this was such an effective feat that by the mid-60s, it was starting to become more standard for NFL teams to do that. And did it work out? Well, if we look, the average PAT percentage in 1965 versus 1955 were up from 93% in 55 to 96% in the average average punt across the league was up by over a yard per punt, which in 10 years may not seem like a sizable gap, but know that in these years only about half of the specialists had switched out for position players, with the very notable Gerald Wilson being the first specialist ever drafted as a punter in 1963 to the Chiefs, followed by Dick Van Raphorst being drafted as the first kicker the following year to the Browns. And you may think, okay, well surely they'd round it out in 1965 with the first long snapper being picked up, right? Right? That actually could not be further from the case. While the rest of specialists were getting drafted or signed purely for their special teams abilities starting in the 50s through the 60s, the first pure long snapper wouldn't arrive until 1970, when former center George Berman, who had been playing since 1964, was signed by the Washington Redskins purely for his long snapping ability, almost 20 years after his other specialist counterparts. And as we watch this snap from a Week 13 game, we get a sense as to why. The punter is standing at 15, almost 16 yards, and this ball hits him right in the belly button. And by the time he gets the ball off, there's not a soul around him, and this whole operation happens without a hitch. Now, the Rams also had a decent long snapper who was a backup center, making it one of the earliest, if not the earliest, games where two teams with long snappers faced off. And with this, the quality of special teams would continue to improve, albeit much slower than other positions, because it's not another long snapper doing well that would encourage teams to pick up a high quality long snapper of their own. Instead, they would have to have their center mess up a snap for a team to truly realize that this was the piece they needed to add to their arsenal. Heck, even the Redskins, who signed their snapper in 71, did so because in the playoffs the previous year, they had a long snap go through the legs of their punter to give the 49ers a 2-score lead to ride out on in the fourth quarter, which was absolutely debilitating. Plays like a botched field goal snap by the Bears in 72 also contributed to this, even though this pass was completed to Dick Butkus. I'm sure it's still something that raised the blood pressure of the Bears. But this would not move teams to draft a pure long snapper until a decade after the first signed pure long snapper. And it was, once again, the Chiefs, notably the ones who drafted the first punter, that would draft Todd Thomas, citing his snapping ability as a huge contributor to his spot. Now, would this bust open the floodgates to where every team was drafting long snappers left and right? Not even close. In fact, it would be almost another decade until the next long snapper would be drafted. But in this time, a movement would begin, a phenomena of private coaching for all specialist positions. And to talk more about this, I had to bring in one of the most prolific long snapping coaches of our time.
My name is Kyle Stelter. I'm the owner of Special Teams University. I train 11 current NFL long snappers, Pro Bowlers, All-Pro selections, and Super Bowl champions. I currently work with the highest paid long snapper in the world, along with international. I currently work with 7 out of 9 of the CFL long snappers. I also work internationally with teams in Germany, Japan, China, and Australia.
Yeah, I wasn't joking. If you have a favorite NFL team, he probably works with their long snapper. If you have a favorite CFL team, he works with their long snapper. If your girl left you for a based long snapper, he was probably trained by this man right here. So I just had some questions for him. Like, what did the private training wave in the early 2000s do for long snappers?
So even just personally, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've innovated the position to the point where I'm developing new drills for this position every single opportunity I have. So I have over 100 drills that weren't available in the early 2000s and before that, when snapping was a thing but not as popular. Everybody has access to this now. You know, private coaching is something that wasn't really available to these older guys.
So with the popularization of long snapping private coaching, I just had to know how that completely changed things from the early 2000s to the modern day.
Some of the biggest changes that you're going to notice in the long snapping position from the early 2000s to today is some changes in rules. Snappers are starting to be more protected. There are rules about staying off the center as far as like if you're within 1 yard of the long snapper, you have to be outside his shoulder width. 2006, they had to stay outside the long snapper's shoulder pads with their helmet. And then in 2010, they started to implement that on punts as well. As far as the technique goes, as the positions become more and more specialized, we see a better understanding, a more refined technique that comes along with that. These guys have all the time in the world to focus on their craft. They're not playing another position like guys in the past. So they're able to kind of develop this role in long snapping and just be able to thrive in that position a little bit more than guys in the past have been able to.
So now we're in the 2020s with modern rules, updated practices, but what does that really mean the modern long snapper looks like? Well, they're no longer centers who picked this up because somebody had to do it, and they aren't just guys who wanted to find a way onto the team. They have taken this position and transcended good. They've probably done something that's never been done by any other position in the history of sports, and that is blended into the fabrics of this game. The level of execution the modern snapper operates at is beyond automatic. You begin to forget as a fan that something can even go wrong on this play. When was the last time you saw a snap rolled back to a punter at the highest level? When was the last truly bad field goal snap you saw? Maybe 2016? The things that make you money now in the NFL as a long snapper is your ability to cover as well as pick up all the various schemes that other teams will use to try to get past you as a blocker. They really have created something amazing, and like I said, let me know if any other sport has a position that is just so blended into the game like long snapper. I bet you can't. But if you enjoyed this history lesson, consider subscribing, and peace.
To go unnoticed, that's my whole job. I have no room for error. It's got to be precise.